Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. And welcome to this session on youth inclusion and protection of civic space from a policy commitment to a peace dividend. My name is Graeme Simpson. I'm the principal representative in New York of Interpeace and the senior peacebuilding advisor and the former lead author of the progress study on youth, peace and security. I'm co-hosting the session with my colleague Sarah Smith from the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. We'd like to welcome you all and thank the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and CIPRI for this opportunity. This session is organized slightly differently. We're focusing on the voice, agency, and leadership of young people. And so we've tried to organize a fishbowl discussion in which the center of this conversation is actually young people and their voice. What we've done is we've organized a recorded dialogue between some young people that we want to set the agenda, shape the conversation, and rather uncharacteristically, we're asking those who are international actors, who have a more global perspective sometimes, to be respondents to this, to respond to the content and to the voices of the young people that we're about to hear. Happily, I think that this Stockholm Forum has already seen some spectacular attention to the issues of young people and their contribution to peace building. If you haven't seen it, I really commend you to look at the extraordinary contribution through her keynote address of Al-Marwan. There was also an amazing session yesterday focusing on how important it is that young people are participating in peace processes to support the legitimacy and the durability of those peace processes. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is hand over to my co-facilitator, Sarah, who will also introduce herself and introduce the dialogue, the pre-recorded dialogue of the four young people. And then we'll, from that, we'll move to what we've called the outer circle of participants who we hope will participate. I should just mention that for those of you who are listening in online, you are able to participate through the text box and to send in any comments or questions that you may have. And to the extent that time allows it, we will try and address some of those. But for now, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Graeme. My name is Sarah Smith, and I work with the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation as a program officer. The foundation works in the memory of the UN Second Secretary General to advance dialogue and policy for sustainable peace and development. In just a few short minutes, we will turn to a pre-recorded dialogue with four practitioners. And for those of you who have registered for the forum, you will hopefully have already had a chance to watch their introductions where they are able to present themselves, but I will briefly present them here as well. Manal Al-Marwan is the program's coordinator with the Youth Leadership Development Foundation in Yemen. Darshatha Gamage is co-founder of Impact Voices in Sri Lanka, as well as social media analyst focused on hate speech and disinformation for #Generation. Bantayehu Gezahegn is a peacebuilding and youth leader in Ethiopia and is co-founder and secretary of the Ethiopian Sustained Dialogue Alumni Network. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Dania Rauda, who is the founder and president of Youth to Lead in El Salvador, and a member of the Americas for the United Network of Young Peacebuilders. So before we go to the video, I wanted to make just a few short observations. First, what we will be showing you here today is an edited version of a much longer and richer discussion. And though we have tried as much as possible to include the main issues raised, there are some things that have perhaps been left out. For those of you who are interested in seeing the conversation in its entirety, we will be uploading the conversation to the Foundation's Vimeo account, and we'll share a link following the completion of this session. Second, while the discussion itself was certainly very rich, the quality of the video that we will see is not always optimal. And I think this is a good reminder to all of us that of the digital divide that does exist, and especially in today's time of COVID-19, and that for some, accessing and participating in online conversations is much more difficult than for others. And third, I just want to reiterate what Graeme has already mentioned in kind of the process of this session. And I really want to encourage you to watch the video and really listen to the conversation that takes place. I think too often we don't spend enough time actually listening to the voices of young people. And this session has really been deliberately designed so that we do spend that time to listen. And I think it's a good reminder that quite often the process of how we engage young people is just as important as the result. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to the pre-recorded Inner Circle dialogue. So I wanted to start the discussion today by asking each one of you, when I say the word youth spaces, or the term youth spaces for sustainable peace and development, what is the kind of the first thing that comes to mind? If you can try to limit it to one word. So Darshatha, what is kind of the one word that comes to mind when I say youth spaces for sustainable peace and development?
For me, it's inclusivity. Not because it's entirely inclusive right now, but maybe that's something we should strive towards.
Great, thank you. Bantayehu, would you like to come in and give your one word for what youth spaces? What word comes to mind?
Rights.
Rights. Dania, sorry.
Yes, participation.
Participation, great. Manal, would you like to come in?
Energy.
Energy.
Yep.
Great. So Bantayehu, would you like to you said the word rights. Would you like to expand on that a little bit? What do you mean by rights, and why is that important when we're talking about youth spaces?
Okay, I think rights at this stage in thinking about youth space are important because I think they are what are missing now. I'm referring to the lack of international frameworks, binding frameworks for the rights of youth. Of course, youth can enjoy human rights like any other human beings under existing treaty mechanisms. But I think so far we have made progress in terms of having specific binding treaties for women, binding treaty for refugees, children, persons with disabilities, and so on. And of course, we recognize diversity among youth, and the youth in their diversity could benefit from any of these human rights instruments. But I think it's time to have a binding commitment internationally, specifically.
Dania, I wonder if you'd like to come in. Do you agree with Bantayehu's kind of statement that there's lack of international frameworks on rights, and perhaps if you want to kind of relate this to participation and expand a little bit on what you mean by participation and youth spaces?
I don't agree at all because I think we do have frameworks talking about laws and international instruments that helps youth to participate. I know the United Nations Security Council resolution for the 2250, and it has a whole framework and is recognized as an international level, national level as well. And it states that we have the right to participate, and in the resolution it states how can we do that. So I think we do have that kind of framework.
Thank you, Dania. And perhaps, like you said, there are some frameworks, but I wonder if perhaps it's about actually implementing the frameworks that we do have. as well. Darshatha, do you feel that the more conventional spaces in Sri Lanka that are used for promoting peace and development, are they open to young people? And if so, what methods are young people in Sri Lanka using to occupy these civic spaces?
Yeah. So in terms of young people occupying civic spaces, we see young people speaking out, especially using online tools like social media, bringing out their thoughts and ideas, and kind of engaging, also sending in political messages, their ideologies and all of it. But to be really honest, in my opinion, young people do not have a meaningful or a participatory engagement at a decision-making level, mainly related into peace and development in the country. There are certain youth involvement and engagement at certain consultation levels that have come in. And in terms of online platforms, we see a lot of majority of the engagement is youth. And especially with the COVID-19 situation, we see a lot of young people engaging in online platforms, youth forums, and webinars sort of thing. But then even though online platforms provide a more inclusive and open space, right now in Sri Lanka, only around 35% of the population has access to internet or engage in this kind of engagement. So that means we are leaving a broader amount of broader young people, broader space of young people outside this space. So that's why still we have to focus on the conventional spaces that are out there. Like we have youth clubs, voluntary organizations that are running and functioning.
Dania, do you agree with this? Is this the case in El Salvador? And then how are young people creating their own spaces?
Well, here in El Salvador, we have, there are the spaces, but it also depends on young people if they would like to participate. And I have seen a lot of offers or a lot of themes that they can work on. For example, the Agenda 2030, it has around 17 thematic that young people can be interested about it. But what I think is when young people do not participate is because they don't have the opportunity, or they don't even know that they have this right or they have this opportunity to participate. Because in a project that we have in our organization, we went to cities in El Salvador where nobody would like to go. So we went there, and people were really, young people they really appreciate it, and they participated in the whole process, and they can continue empowering their communities. But I think sometimes there are the spaces, but there are no people that go to the places that nobody goes.
Thank you. Manal, are there other kind of tools or methods that young people in Yemen are using to engage and create new spaces?
Thank you for Dania and for you too. So when we used to have any awareness for the community, we go through simple sarcastic messages that aims to raise awareness of vulnerable groups in the society. So engaging youth inside the social media platforms is very important to go through the vulnerable groups in the society and do actions on the reality ground.
Thank you, Manal. And I think this points to what Dania was also raising about the lack of awareness, and that many young people are maybe not aware of the different opportunities that exist, and they need to kind of raise this awareness. Darshatha, you spoke about the need to keep organizing youth formally through civic and community organizations and youth organizations, and seeking formal political or policy spaces. Could you expand a little bit on, are those spaces, or do you feel like those spaces are open to young people?
Right now, I don't see a lot of openings for young people because young people are not recognized as equal and viable partners in most of the discussions and dialogues. So that's one of the key challenges I think that's out there. And also another, I think, reason is that most of the time youth is recognized as one category, but then I would see youth as a cross-section or as a cross-cutting section of our society, and it is as diverse as our society is. So, I mean, for me, I will not ever represent all the young people of this country or even in my area. It's very much diverse. So it is important that we acknowledge the diversity among youth rather than recognizing youth as one setting. So yeah, that's my input.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point that you make, that young people are diverse. And when we talk about youth participation, we really need to look at the, like you were saying, the cross-cutting identities that young people make up. Dania, what is the biggest barrier to meaningful youth participation and in civic spaces, and what is needed to overcome this barrier?
When we talk about civic spaces, the biggest challenge for us is the violence we live in our country. When talking about these gang members, when we cannot go into the communities without a partnership with another NGO. But I think the consequence of doing so without this protocol, without these guidelines, is that we put in risk our lives. So that is like the biggest challenge, and what we can do to improve that is to look forward to more partnerships. And I know here in El Salvador, the new government, the new administration is working very hard to clean or to stop this type of organizations like gang members. If the government has good results on that, I think in the future we will not be in trouble going to a community and organize the civic spaces or participating in some in which we don't have access to it right now due to the violence that we live.
I think that you raise a very important point, that many young people who are engaging in these spaces do encounter violence and repression. So Manal, I was wondering if you could maybe, do you agree with the points raised by Dania and Darshatha in terms of the barriers to meaningful participation, and what other kind of barriers are there in Yemen, and what is needed to overcome that?
Yeah, sure. I agree with them, but maybe because of the different communities and also different overviews of the communities, maybe different from Sri Lanka, it differs from Yemen, it differs from environment to the other. For example, for us in Yemen, we face a really big problem and issues regarding the word peace exactly. I mean, when we need to implement regard peace, so that means it's a red flag in our authorities nowadays. Maybe you will be a little bit amazed, but this is the reality because of the current situation in the war regarding Yemen. They said, where does this peace comes from? What are you really talking about? Are you talking about peace? And there are more than 15 countries are issuing a shitty war to Yemen. So what are you talking about nowadays? There is no peace just to speak about. So we face many problems regarding the word peace. We try to maybe to change the name, and there are many different names to just implement any activity. So we have a lot of issues regarding authorities and to just get a license or any permit just to have any activities with initiatives. and with other youth.
Thank you, Manal. Yeah, and I think again that speaks to the point that Dania was making, that there are these, not only are young people facing violence and repression, but that there are these systematic barriers that make it difficult for young people to engage in these spaces. And I was wondering, maybe just to pick up on that a little bit, aren't young people still mostly seen as the problem by their governments rather than creative peace builders? Is there anyone that wants to kind of pick up on that? Manal, go ahead.
Yeah, as I mentioned previously, that young people are really energetic, and if authorities in the community didn't engage them for in any activities or decision making, so this might be a strike for them, because youth always, for example, in my community, they can change a law. I mean, young people can change in any case or any injustice action by organizing campaigns through social media platforms. To just in reality a little bit difficult because of the complex movements imposed by the authorities to implement any activity. So maybe the conflicts will be raised more. So they have to be engaged in anything. The youth are very, very energetic, and they need to do any action or any activities to do so.
Darshatha, I see that you have your hand raised. If you want to come on this point of, yeah, go ahead.
I think there is an increasing tendency to get young people involved. In Sri Lanka, I've seen more decision makers, political actors getting young people involved in their certain discussions, but which is a good trend. But then still it's at more of a tokenized level rather than getting it improved in active or meaningful engagement.
Bantayehu, I'll let you come in on this discussion as well. And if you want to share, based on your experiences in Ethiopia, what do you feel is the biggest barrier to young people's meaningful participation? And do you agree that with what the others have raised, that there are these kind of a lot of structural barriers that make it difficult for young people to be able to engage in the way that they want to?
I start by agreeing with what has been said, that I think the attitude towards youth still is that either youth are problems, or that we need to engage youth for the sake of something else. That's for the sake of peace, or for the sake of, let's say, discussing migration or terrorism, or and so on. So I haven't seen any discussion that takes into account youth for the sake of youth. I think there are two barriers. The first one is political and civic exclusion. And I think this is systematic, because we know that young people drive political changes, civic movements, and so on, soon to be sidelined from engaging in formal and real political participation, be it in parliamentary participation, political parties, peace negotiations, transitions, and so on. Even post-transition constitutions do not really recognize youth as right holders, but they discuss youth as when they discuss limits on constitutional rights. So my second point is economic inclusion. It seems that there is mostly a mechanical understanding of youth and jobs, meaning we need to rethink the way we discuss youth and employment, or youth and jobs. There is a tendency to increase jobs so that youth will become silent or busy, and they don't disturb the peace. But why don't we, as you mentioned earlier, revisit our education systems to really make it empowering, so that young people by themselves will create their own jobs, will lead, and so on. So I think the barriers are systematic, and the solutions should be also systematic.
Thank you, and I think you raise a couple of interesting points here, and both in terms of this this question, which I think a lot of people are asking themselves, and a lot of the people in the outer circle are asking themselves of to what extent do we mainstream kind of youth peace and security throughout our programming without kind of then diluting it and making sure that there is a focus on youth for the sake of youth, as you put it. I think we've already kind of alluded a little bit to this, but listening into this conversation in the outer circle are a number of representatives from government, from donor agencies, from the United Nations, non-governmental organizations, and civil society organizations. Based on the kind of the challenges that you've just been discussing here, what would you like to say to these people in the outer circle in terms of what they can do to support and invest in young people's ability to organize, participate, and communicate, but also to protect these spaces? Dania, would you like to come in?
Yes. Yeah, what has worked with us is to make partnerships with youth organizations that are small, because in those kind of organizations are very organic, and we can get young people that they can't probably make it. So to get involved with small youth organizations and hear them.
Thank you, Dania. Manal, would you like to come in here and kind of give your final reflections in terms of your message to those sitting in the outer circle, and what they can do to support and invest in youth spaces in Yemen?
As they said, participants, they said many their point of view. Very thank you for them. Political parties and decision makers they have to they always see youth as an experienced people, so they're not heard and they're not listened to their opinions. Actually, they have to invest their capabilities and support their ideas, especially as they are their ideas are renewable and actionable ideas. Always youth are marginalized on this side. So people in other circles should respect their concepts, respect their ideas, and also listen to them. Especially nowadays, it's not difficult to see their overview and their opinions.
Can I just follow up on that? Could you speak more concretely when you say kind of respect young people? I think for a lot of people, that for them they can easily say we respect young people. What kind of, is there a concrete thing that they can do to show that they are respecting young people and that they are investing in young people?
Previously, we used to have a government for youth in Yemen. And that government is not activated nowadays because of the current situation. So if they need to really show respect to this young people, they could reactivate this youth government again.
So ensure that there are kind of political and institutional systems in place that really are focusing on youth and the needs of young people.
Exactly.
Darshatha, would you like to come in here and from your experiences and perspectives in Sri Lanka, what would you like to say to those sitting in the outer circle?
I think the key focus should be on looking at meaningful youth participation and youth engagement that takes young people from being merely tokenized into a position of shared decision making. And I think maybe in Sri Lanka I would say 4 areas that you should focus on. And also, I think also drawing from the discussion that we had, firstly, I think there should be recognition of the rights of young people to participate actively in social, political, economic, and cultural spheres. Then secondly, I think it's also strengthening and empowering young people's capacities through education and other non-formal and non-traditional methods, getting young people strengthening their capacities, empowering them so that they have the means to engage. And thirdly, I think it's providing the right space and the opportunity, which also includes recognizing the role of youth as a cross-cutting contributor for all social issues, as young people are affected by almost all social issues around there. So young people should also be recognized as people who have a role to play and as contributors, as like I said before, as equal and viable partners who can contribute to almost all social issues out there. And of course, finally, I would say to provide adequate support and resources. This means at times financial and also non-financial resources to ensure that young people are in a position that they can contribute and engage meaningfully as civic actors.
Thank you, Darshatha. And I think that relates to in a recent study that the foundation did on how the UN in particular is working with 2250 at the country level, in which Sri Lanka was one of those countries that we looked at. The need to kind of move beyond this tokenistic engagement of young people and really make sure that young people are not just kind of approached once or after the project or program is designed, but that they're really part of that design process and even pre-design process. So from start to finish is really critical to ensuring that that young people are meaningfully engaged in these initiatives. Bantayehu, I'll let you come in and give your kind of final words to the outer circle.
I would like to convey 3 messages which are derived from my understanding of the barriers to use inclusion and civic space. So the first one would be, as I tried to allude to before, we should rethink the way we approach and understand youth. Let's bring youth to the center, and let's consider youth as actors, not as factors. And that applies to national governments and everyone. And the second message would be, I would like to make a bold recommendation that we really need to come up with a separate framework at the international level. The past decade, there have been important milestones in terms of Resolution 2250, the Missing Peace Study, and also it's recognizable that the Missing Peace Study recommended to mainstream youth issues in all UN human rights mechanisms. So building on that success, let's take the deliberation further and let's consider a separate framework for youth, which will be instrumental to change our thinking. And finally, I think in connection with COVID-19, youth, especially in developing countries, may be affected disproportionately. And if we consider the diversity among youth, there could be also different groups of youth who will be more severely affected. So to the donor community, I would encourage them to really consider their investments, that they take into account the peculiar challenge that may be posed by COVID-19 in the post-COVID-19 world. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think the last point you raised is really important, that donors recognize how the pandemic is affecting those who are most vulnerable, and that there is a need to maybe be flexible in the way that they are supporting these initiatives. So thank you. I want to thank all of you for participating in today's discussion, and for sharing your reflections and experiences. And now I'll turn it back to Graeme for the to get the responses from the outer circle participants, and then looking forward to hearing from the 4 participants here today, to respond to the responses from the outer circle, and to give some final reflections.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope all of you enjoyed as much as I did, hearing the uncensored, candid perspectives of young people themselves across extraordinary different contexts, from Ethiopia, Salvador, Sri Lanka, Yemen. Also speaking about the sort of diverse range of arenas of conflict and peace building that they're involved in. I want to bring in Jatma Wickramaniyake, the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. Jatma, I think what we can hear in the voice of young people is, on one hand, a recognition of the advances of the youth, peace and security agenda through Security Council resolutions and the like, but at the same time, some frustration about the need to move from policy and rhetoric to delivery and implementation. And also mindful of the fact that the civic spaces which young people occupy so creatively as peace builders are often being shut down. And I wonder if you could just comment on how you think we can move the needle on moving this youth, peace and security agenda from rhetoric to implementation, and how we can protect the spaces that young people occupy.
Thank you very much, Graeme. That's $1 million question. I'll try to answer that in 2 minutes. To answer the first part of your question, and really congratulations to Darshatha, Dania, Bantayehu, and Manal for these awesome reflections and looking at it from a global perspective. Graeme, you said there is progress being made and there's also frustration. I'm certainly one of those people most skewed to the frustration side of this paradigm. And I think that even after 5 years down of adoption of 2250 resolution by the Security Council, still we do not have enough traction on the ground, particularly with governments, particularly with member states. To date, we still do not have any national action plans on youth, peace and security, or concrete systematic measures, as Bantayehu mentioned, to integrate youth into actual decision-making on peace and security issues at the country level. So when you ask how can we move the needle on the YPS agenda as a whole, I think the first thing we need is political commitment and accountability from governments. Accountability to the commitments that they have made at the Security Council, at the Human Rights Council, at the General Assembly, at the various regional mechanisms, and really translate this into concrete policies, either national action plans, either integrating them into the existing action plans of women, peace and security, civil society inclusion, the national security strategies, or really showing that this is XYZ, how we will integrate young people into the formal system. And the second is the financial commitments. We need to put our money where our mouth is. And particularly after COVID-19, many youth organizations, which are informal, voluntary networks of unregistered networks of young people coming together, are going to find it difficult to access funding and resources. And this is not just financial support to youth organizations, but also tools and knowledge and spaces to network. And that really ties into the second part of your question when you ask what needs to be done to create more safe spaces for young people. And listening to the conversation and how the youth speakers were talking a lot about the civic space, I really find it difficult to distinguish the civic space from the personal space and the public space and the digital space. I think these are very interconnected. So you cannot have a safe space a civic space for young people if as a young person can't make decisions on their behalf, can't make decisions about their own identity, can't make decisions about their own life, about their own bodies, the way they introduce themselves, their sexual orientation or gender identity, or how they protect themselves and their personal and bodily security as an individual. And particularly for young women and girls who are victims of increasing gender-based violence, particularly during COVID-19, this protection of personal space, I think, is also very strongly linked to the protection of civic space. And then obviously civic space expands, in my opinion, into also public spaces like maybe parks, the recreational activities, the youth centers, and the many initiatives that the youth speakers talked about this morning, but also the public political space, the spaces that are there for young people to be part of political parties, the spaces there for young people to run for political office. We cannot talk about systemic integration of young people in peace processes or in peace initiatives if 73% of interparliamentary unions member countries have age restrictions of young people running for political office. So for me, really, the personal space, the civic space, the political space, the public space is very much interlinked. And then young people have found ways to convert the digital spaces, which were not originally created for political or civic purposes, into actually places where they protest, where they demonstrate, where they discuss issues of concern. So the protection of digital space and protection of young people who are active in digital space from bullying, from violence, but also from hate speech and other sort of violent activity is also important. I just want to wrap up because yesterday in the news I saw that Facebook apologized for the violence in Sri Lanka and the role that Facebook as a digital platform played. But I just want to ask the question, where is the accountability then? And how are we going to make sure that that doesn't happen going forward? And I think a lot of the time young people have the answers for these questions. We just really need to create that space of intergenerational dialogue where we can find the solutions together. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayatma. We're already getting a lot of really interesting input online about this question of young people being too young to run, the human rights context in which we need to protect young people who are not able to realize their human rights, etc., etc. I want to bring in Johannes Oljelund, and from your perspective as the Director General for International Development Cooperation, the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'm eager to hear what your response is to what you've heard from young people, and particularly how you think we can support young peace builders in protection of this sort of civic space, and how we address governments who act to repress or close down those spaces.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for allowing me to listen in and get advice and I think guidance on how we should act. I heard some very clear messages on how we should operate and what we should consider in our development cooperation and really in our foreign policy more broadly. And I think that I kind of see three categories, very clear categories coming out. The first is to see and listen and really have that conversation and also within that to be aware of diversity and not treat youth as a homogeneous group, but as really to have that conversation broadly. Strong and good advice. The other part is, of course, on funding opportunities, which is perhaps my primary area as DG for Development Cooperation. And I think there we can do more, and I think we also have to be more to push further with the localization agenda that I also know has been a part of the discussion this week. Our ability to fund closer to the ground and to more to organizations that are not necessarily big international strong organizations. This is I'll be very clear. It's a challenge. It's a practical challenge, but a challenge that we must take. Third, of course, is exactly what you're referring to: the open and safe environments for this conversation. And that's a normative agenda and but also a practical agenda where we need to push with our partner governments or with governments that have the responsibility to create this space, and where we have to be very clear and keep coming back to this point. Advice taken on that, really. Absolutely. I would also like to say, just as a reflection, I see a few opportunities ahead of us. One is, of course, the review of the peace-building architecture, which is an opportunity to address also these issues. A chance to push further, both in practical and normative terms. I think that's a good chance. I happen to sit on the advisory board of the Peacebuilding Fund, or actually our term is out now, so I don't know. But I used to sit there, and there we were very proud of the Youth and Gender Initiative, which is exactly this: an opportunity to go further with funding, including to push beyond big, well-known organizations. So that's great. I think in the multilateral context, we can learn from that and pick up from that experience and push it also in other contexts. Finally, many have made the reflection on the opportunities that are clearly here in digitalization and the possibility to use that for. But I also think that the point made was that it's a great opportunity, but also encompassed with the same challenges that are there in the non-digital for us. So the issue of access and real access is, of course, an add-on, so to speak, for people to have access to. But otherwise, the challenges there are the same: funding, being listened to for real. And having that space for that conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Metsi Maketa here as UN Resident Coordinator for Burkina Faso. Metsi, I'm really interested in whether you hear echoes in the voices you've heard today, whether you hear echoes of that in the context of Burkina, and also particularly what you think from the UN perspective. And as a regional coordinator, a resident coordinator, what do you think the UN can do to be most responsive to these needs and to drive this at a country level?
So, Graeme, the 10.3 million Burkinabe youth, which represent 53% of the population, express exactly the same concerns and the same aspirations. So they are connected to the global community. The echoes are the same. The second thing to note is that this is the same youth that in 2015 generated spaces that enabled the ushering in 2016 of what was considered a successful political transition and the first civilian democratically elected government. Today, unfortunately, the spaces created risk to be shrinked, the aspirations may be thwarted, and the social contract that are signed then is also at risk as the country is grappling with a very serious crisis linked to what's happening in the Sahel region. Most recently, when I met with the youth groups, they told me directly that they are the ones killed as soldiers, they are the ones being targeted by armed groups, they are the ones that are also being subjects of suspicions by the security forces. They are the ones that are forcibly displaced, and they are the ones that are looking for opportunities. They are at the center of everything. That was their message to me. Your question, what do we do about this as the UN? I just told you about the encounter that I had with them recently. So the first thing that we did in country was create spaces for listening, but particularly ensuring that we build a relationship of trust. The second thing that we are doing is helping them be in their own spaces, connect, coordinate, exchange. We recently set up a platform that we will be supporting where they can do so as a network of youth in the context of supporting youth, peace and development in Burkina Faso. And finally, we are also ensuring that as we do that, it is linked to policy, it is linked to sustainability. This cannot happen without partnerships, and I'm glad to hear Johannes on the call that we have been able to do so as a result of some of the financing that we are getting through the Peacebuilding funds and some other instruments that are flexible that enable us to engage in creating these spaces and opportunities for us with youth to really create voice such that there can be policies that take into account the realities as they unfold.
Thanks, Metsi. If I can just encourage those who are going to contribute to try and stick to the short comments, because I don't want to be in a situation where the young people who we're going to go to at the end of this are silenced once again. So I will cut us if we have to go to those young people. From a very different perspective, Charlotte Davidi, communications coordinator at the United Network of Young Peace Builders, UNOI. I'm really interested in how you see this and how UNOI can advance efforts to access diverse young people to ensure they get the sort of support they need from governments and civil society organizations and multilateral organizations. Your thinking on this?
Thanks, Graeme, and thanks to the 4 young peace builders for sharing their rich insights. So from the global perspective of the UNOY network, the state of civic space is severely alarming. State and non-state actors are overarmed and young peace builders are underfunded and under-supported. And in our most recent annual survey, 1/3 of our member organizations reported lack of civic space as the most pressing challenge facing young peace builders. And yes, as Darshatha mentioned, the youth demographic is very diverse, as are the threats they face. From continuous murders of social leaders with impunity in Colombia and Brazil, to youth groups unable to access funds in Pakistan, Egypt, Azerbaijan, the list goes on. How do we reach beyond youth elites? Adapt. We have to adapt needs from the ground up. And when we talk about systemic barriers, we need to talk about access to information. As our speakers mentioned, what is digital civic space for those without access to it? And of course, access to funding and opportunities. Ultimately, belonging to an international network can offer a cloak of protection for grassroots activists. And just yesterday, we released a statement calling for the protection of citizens from gang violence in Haiti, where our member is currently at high risk. But we need support. Concretely, we need support to establish partnerships for rapid protection mechanisms specifically designed for young peace builders. We need to earmark funding specifically for the protection of young peace builders, enable political environments where young people's human rights are upheld. This means accountability and denouncing cases of state and non-state actors labeling lawful and healthy social dissent a security threat. Most importantly, support and invest in young peace builders who are creative experts in their own context to ensure that they can continue engaging their peers and communities safely without risk to their life in matters of peace and security. And lastly, the Swedish MFA has been a champion of the YPS agenda, and we hope we can count on your continued investment in youth-led peace building. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte. I want to move now to Fatima Mohammed from the Program Officer in Youth and Innovation, UNFPA Somalia. Fatima, you're one of the few people within the UN system who has the word youth in your title. I'm intrigued in your response to what you've heard today, and particularly ask you to reflect on how what you've heard differentially impacts young peace builders in the context that you're in, such as Somalia.
Thank you, Graeme. That's right. I'm one of those few people who have the title. And I think what I've heard from the young people, and I thank them for their contribution on meaningful participation, on partnership, on capacity building. And all these things are very important. In Somalia, for example, if I reflect on Somalia's situation, and especially on young women, we have a patriarchal society where their voices are not listened to. They cannot be able to sit in resolution committees, for example, or in civic spaces where elders are the ones who are actually selecting them. It gets pretty hard for young women to even get included. So, and I want to reflect on one example, and we are one of those few countries who actually funding to Resolution 2250, we had this project called Youth Political Empowerment, where we had capacity building of youth actors, youth peace builders. We had campaigns and intergenerational dialogue with elders. And this actually had an impact, and it was only in 2 states, had an impact somehow in terms of formal civic spaces, where we had 43 out of 95 young people being elected in positions, parliamentary positions. But did that translate to young women getting positions? No, there were only 8 out of the 43 that got elected. And we talk about this 43, it's 15 to 35. So it wasn't like there were people less than 24 years were elected. So basically, young people are striving, making sure that they make impact, and but we still need to invest more, and especially invest more on young women. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the text box is filling with a whole lot of comments, including a lot of it focused on the innovation, creativity of young people as peace builders, challenging the notions that they're too inexperienced or that they're too young to occupy key political positions. But at the same time, young people are still very often treated as a threat or a problem. And I want to bring in Jordan Street from an international peacebuilding organization, Safer World, to comment on this, to possibly help us think through what you see as some of the major hurdles to the way in which young people can occupy these spaces.
Thanks, Graeme, and thanks to all the organisers and speakers. I'm glad to speak after Fatuma and hear about her work in Somalia, because in Somalia I'm still a young person thanks to their generous definition, so that makes me happy. Look, to your question, I think it's really important to flag that too many governments right now, and some within the UN, are still treating youth as this threat and favouring policies and funding for agendas such as countering violent extremism and counter-terrorism, which are fundamentally what governments are using to close down civic space. The Special Rapporteur has detailed evidence on how governments are using these agendas to do that. Last year's counter-terrorism budget at the UN was $522 million. Let me just tell you, the investment in youth peace building was not that. Despite some positive stuff we're seeing, it's not $522 million. And so this investment is actually going in the face of what's working. The missing piece, which Graeme wrote, but many of us contributed to, provided that evidence of actually what is working and what's not. And counterterrorism in CV isn't working. It's not helping youth agency. It's not helping youth resilience. It's actually making us, societies we live in, less safe. If you can find any evaluations that tell me CV programs working, please send them to me. They don't exist, yet we're still investing in these agendas. So what I would say to kind of donor governments and our champions here today, like Sweden, is, really put your money where your mouth is and invest in that positive upside. What we need you to do is to push other governments to be doing the same. We need positive approaches at the multilateral level, but also from your donor agencies, and we are starting to see that, and that's welcome. But too often, governments say one thing, and then the rhetoric returns to the same, these narrow securitized agendas. So the kind of thing I would say is really, really push back on those that are attacking human rights, that are attacking civic space, with funding as well as strong rhetoric at the multilateral level.
Thank you. I think that's really provocative and really striking. It resonates quite strongly with one of the things that one of the young people said when she said, in some of our contexts, just using the word peace raises a red flag, that the constraints on what we can do and what we can't. I want to bring in Rebecca Adda-Dontoh, Peace and Development Advisor in the UN Resident Coordinator's Office in the Gambia. Really interested to hear your perspective on this as a Peace and Development Advisor, this notion that peace is sometimes a red flag, and also raise the question of whether or not this is a universal experience. It seems to me that this may be very different in different conflict contexts, and how you think about this from the perspective of the Gambia.
Thank you very much, and thank you to my senior colleague, Metsi, who has already touched on some of the things the UN is doing. Yes, my response to Manal's statement is that of understanding, because I have encountered situations in which peace has actually evoked denial, or sometimes outright resentment. And that is also because of the conditions prevailing in that place. But that said, I think that it is very important that youth are really engaged and mobilized and to strengthen their capacities, not just to participate in numbers, but also substantively. Yes, the numbers matter, but the substantive engagement also matters. In the Gambia, for example, that is perceived as relatively peaceful, you've played a very active role in mobilizing and having the peaceful transition in which we are. And the country is currently engaged in the transitional reforms. And so the UN in the Gambia has supported the youth to really help amplify their voices, to convene, to participate actively in this process of constitutional review commission, the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission, but also in terms of monitoring human rights and standing up for human rights. So in the Gambia, unlike in other places, maybe like Yemen, where peace evokes such sentiments because people are either tired of the violence or have lost hope of peace. We at the UN cannot lose that hope, and so we feel challenged and in the Gambia to continue to accompany these processes, but also to ensure that the policy frameworks are also put in place. Our UNFPA colleagues in the Gambia are leading these processes. The Peacebuilding Fund is supporting, and we are actively mobilizing and engaging and accompanying across the sectors, across the levels, across the policy framework, but also to look at the structural and systemic issues that are obstacles to youth participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sarah Dola, you're program manager at Fresusit, an organization working to build capacity for young people to mediate and peacefully resolve conflict in their communities in Sweden. I'm really interested in how, as a locally based youth organization, you see this in a very different context, how you can help to expand and protect the spaces that young people occupy, and whether or not this resonates with your experience in the Swedish context.
Hi, thank you. Yes, we've been hearing about Sweden in this conversation now as one of the donors and supporters of the 2250 agenda, and I think that's wonderful. Yet at the same time, to be a little bit provocative, perhaps, we also need to look at our own way of including youth in decision-making when it comes to preventing, sustaining peace. I think that's probably what's most important for us. And the youth I work with in our groups, they really show having experience of serious conflicts and serious results of what we see as systemic failures of inclusion. And I think when we talk about including youth, we need to understand that it's not easy because it's not part of the regular way of doing things that we've been, it's just not part of the power structures that we've been having for many years before we adopted something like 2250, or in the same way when we can think about 1325, we need to change our way of thinking of inclusion, and we need to think about how we build trust between groups. Also, youth who have felt marginalized don't trust agencies and decision makers. And so how do we do this? And my strong advice to decision makers, agencies, and so on is that they look to youth organizations and existing networks that actually know how to do this and to provide them the how of inclusion. And it's actually hard work. It requires commitment and it requires time. So inclusion doesn't just happen by itself. It's hard and arduous work, but it will result in a more sustainable peace or upholding of peace.
Thank you. In the course of the progress study on missing peace, we heard young people extremely vocal about saying, don't ghettoize us just into the arena of youth organizations. Don't see us just as involvement in formal political spaces. Every policy arena that affects our lives, we should have a stake in. And that includes in the economic environment and the development environment. Young people said every SDG is a youth SDG. I'd like to bring in Katarina Fabianson, Senior Advisor, Human Security in CEDA. Two questions. The one is, how do you respond to the challenge that young people have raised? And I think that Jayatma reiterated about the importance of putting our money where our mouths are, the funding of this and the donor challenge to get money into the hands of the right people, young people, and also the critical intersection between Agenda 2030, a development agenda, and these concerns around youth, peace and security.
Great. Thank you so much, Graeme, and wonderful to be here and to listen to the dialogue. I was especially interested in the discussions on diversity, meaningful participation, and encouragement, entrepreneurship, and creative thinking, partnerships. But when it comes to, for instance, from a donor perspective with regards to Agenda 2030, I think it's crucial to mainstream a youth perspective throughout all the programming to ensure inclusion and create space for meaningful participation by young women and men. Be this through revised school curricula that encourages creative thinking and entrepreneurship, or be it through actually establishing systems that do provide the space. And to do so, it's extremely important to understand diversity, as was mentioned before, not only among young women and men, but also between different contexts and between different countries and within and contexts within and across countries. I think the world is starting to understand the inefficiency of tokenism and now needs to become better in ensuring meaningful participation and listen to and respond to all the many diverse and creative ideas that are out there and actually provide proof that this has been listened to and led to results. What we at CEDA are trying to do is follow the recommendations from the Missing Piece, which we were happy to co-fund, by both encouraging partnerships through by supporting youth-led networks and by identifying flexible ways to support smaller youth initiatives that are not necessarily organized under established civil society organizations. There are many good initiatives out there that often don't require much funding, and the donor community, we need to continue to find ways to flexibly support this. And at CEDA, we also channel funds through course support, which allows our partners a bit more flexibility. And I also think one last important part that the donor community can play is to assist in highlighting all the positive examples of how young women and men do contribute to peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have a lot of time, but I want to make sure that each of the young people who participated in this panel get an opportunity to respond. I'm not sure if Manal is online, so I'm going to start with Bantayehu. Bantayehu, sorry. In a minute, can you tell us if you feel heard, what you think are the critical issues that resonate with what you were trying to articulate?
Yes, indeed. I think we have made great progress in terms of the YPF, but from the distinguished speaker, it was clear to understand that youth challenge and youth issues are multifaceted and different in different contexts. And that's why I was recommending to have a more comprehensive commitment globally so that we understand better and include all these diverse issues in a more binding format. In fact, it doesn't mean that the law will solve every problem, but I think that it's a big piece. And secondly, especially once you have a binding commitment in situations where resources are scarce, then youth issues will not be deprioritized if they're in the law, but if they're in policies and if they're part of thematic commitments, then there is a risk of deprioritizing youth issues continuously. Finally, if I am allowed, I would like to thank the Life and Peace Institute and the Peace and Development Center in Ethiopia for their great support for youth and peace building for the past decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Bantayehu. Manal, your last responses, your thoughts?
Sorry?
Do we have Manal? I think we're having a little trouble with the connection. Perhaps I can move on to Dania. Dania, your thoughts in closing?
Yeah, thank you. Well, about all the insights and to summarize everything, I like the summarize of the UN Secretary General's envoy for youth. She summarized that it's very important to work with small organizations because that's the key to guarantee that young people in an organic way, they can participate. And I know the UN is a political forum, and they mostly engage with governments. However, it's very important to also have the commitment for the governments to work with young people, and also that will facilitate for us to have those resources or financial resources that sometimes we need to work. And about the implementation, which is the biggest issue for us, implementation. I know there's a whole framework for youth participation, but implementation needs to go with the hands of the youth organizations as well of the governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dania. I wanted to try Manal one more time if I can. Okay. Darshatha, perhaps we can go to you from your perspective. We're not hearing Darshatha.
Hello. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. My final thoughts is that what simply I've been repeating maybe quite a few times throughout this discussion is about meaningful participation of young people. And I am thankful for all the respondents who are here, who very much reiterated on the need and highlighted different aspects of it. So thank you for all those like-minded partners. So I simply request all of you who are also listening and joining in here to take this forward, take it back to your workplaces, take it back to your design tables, and make sure that young people are part of your discussions. Young people are at the table at each stage of the discussion, from the beginning from the beginning till the end, and that youth can also add in and ensure that there is meaningful inclusion. So that is my last input, and I thank you all of you, and I really hope that we can take this forward.
I'm going to give it one more try to see if we can get Manal on the line. Do we have Manal?
Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you. We'd love your responses.
Okay. Actually, sorry for the misconnection here in my internet. Actually, it's very important that awareness and advocacy are key activities, but it's crucial to make efforts to campaign such activities with more tangible activities that address women and youth needs, such as improvement of access and quality of basic services and or livelihood opportunities. And also, women and youth are at risk to just participate and be engaged on this as well.
Thank you, Manal. We have almost reached our hard deadline and close, and thank you all so much for your contributions. I think
and
what
just,
is most
Graeme,
striking... Sorry. Yes,
Can I just jump in and say, I know that we've received a lot of comments and questions from the audience, and unfortunately we weren't able to address all of them here today, but know that we received them.
Thank you. And a very strong representation of concerns over the human rights protections of young people, very powerful, challenging comments on the importance of recognizing that young people are not too inexperienced or too young to hold and occupy political office and participate in the policy spaces that affect their lives, a recognition of the need to reassure threatened older generation politicians to ensure that the space is created for transgenerational dialogue. We've had fascinating contributions on all of this, and of course a real emphasis on the distinct experiences of young women and the importance of a gendered discourse around this. In conclusion, I'll say this. Young people are demonstrating more than anything else that investment in youth-led peace building is fundamentally about sustaining peace. It's about engagements across very different conflict contexts. It's engagements with different typologies of violence. It's about the innovative, creative, and resourceful resilience of young people rather than treating them as a risk or a threat. These are very strong messages that came out in the Progress Strategy on Youth, Peace and Security and that are being reaffirmed by young people very strongly today. The COVID-19 crisis illustrates all of the same issues of exclusion and marginalization that young people complained about. Their exclusion from education as education systems close down. Their lack of horizons economically as the economy is under pressure. Their lack of political participation in the policy spaces that affect their lives. We have another clear message about the importance of investing in youth-led peace building in the interest of youth, peace and security, in the interest of sustaining peace for all of us. With that, I thank you all for your time. And on behalf of Sarah, the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and Interpeace, thank you very much for your participation in this forum and for listening in, and especially to the young people for their candor, honesty and directness and their voice. Thank you so much.